Hello, everyone. Yeah, just providing feedback from last week's assignment, covering, white fragility, good white people. As I mentioned in class the other day, the first couple weeks of term provided individual video feedback, and I'm going to try this model out of providing kind of a comprehensive overall kind of review of the class content or class responses. And then I provide some individual feedback on papers if there's, a concern, or sometimes, it's like, wow, that was pretty amazing. Sometimes there'll be a short comment on your paper, but I'm here for you. If you ever have any questions, if you want more information, or you do want individual feedback each week, let me know. I'm going to do it this way too. I'm trying it out because I think I can provide more information, food for thought, more perspective, and hopefully make the feedback more meaningful and valuable to you this way. Let's kind of start off with Sullivan's her talk about good white people. If you're interested in this topic area, I really encourage you to read her book. Her book is really fascinating. She provides a lot of background in terms of how she got into this work. She's a philosopher by profession. She's an existential philosopher, so issues of identity, existence is kind of a core part of her investigation. And she got into, as she mentioned, I believe in the talk, about racial identities. I mean, it wasn't something that she set out to examine through the course of her academic career, but it's something that she eventually kind of got into as she explored more and more aspects of identity. And everyone did a really nice job of covering, covering content, like things you found very, very interesting, very valuable. Oh, one more, got a little note to myself. So there's quite a few individuals in the class identified, the authors as he. So both Patricia Hill, Shannon Sullivan for the presentation, and then it's D'Angelo, female author, writer as well. So just be mindful of the author in the write-up. Okay, so yeah, the first section, this interesting thing about, that racism is, sometimes we think about this overt aspect, the Confederate flag versus yoga pants, as a couple of you mentioned, that stood out to you. These deflective strategies, thinking that it was in the past. Somebody mentioned, whiteness as it's unmarked. This sort of remind me of sort of Peggy McIntosh's work in The Invisible Knapsack. These privileges that exist in parts of our identity in terms of place of privilege that exists without sort of being aware of that. The difficulty of discussing race as a white parent. There are a lot of you mentioned that the study that was done, asking 100 white parents to talk about race with their children, and a lot of them are uncomfortable doing that, didn't have the language, didn't have the background to do that, and just didn't engage in that particular experiment. Pretty insightful, if others are bad, like it's the bad folks over there, that means it gives oneself relief. It's not my responsibility, or it's not me that's part of the system. Somebody mentioned, it's important to start having conversations, about race with other whites, with other people of the dominant group. That's interesting. Somebody mentioned like the coexist stickers, that like I had a Bend aha moment, like, oh man, that's like, Central Oregon, this thing that it's all liberal, it's like this place of, it's liberal space. And there's sort of probably you start scratching around underneath a little bit, that there's class-based issues, there's race-based issues, there's other inequalities that are there in our social system. It's easy to maintain sort of neutrality, maintain a sense of to not be racist, to not hold on to any ideas and prejudices when one is in a relatively secure kind of social position. It's easy to make the claim. Now the question is, to what extent are people actually living that out? This is where you can start to get into the anti-racism component. We start to think about race as being, well, I'm being neutral, I'm not harming anyone, I'm not doing anything to reproduce that particular system. But if you're not actively engaged in changing the system, you're actually benefiting from the system, and that's kind of part of the challenge. Somebody mentioned, that colorblind racism is a different form of violence than looking back, for example, in Jim Crow South, following emancipation, following after Reconstruction and after the U.S. military was removed from the South, and Jim Crow laws started to come into play. All the separate but equal kind of things. And that was very overt. Things like redlining, with banking and not loaning money in particular areas. That was very overt discrimination. And now it's like this is a different form of discrimination or racism today. It's this idea of colorblind racism. It's a different form of violence. One student said, and I thought that was pretty powerful. And then sort of ending up this like self-love, is an important component. And this kind of goes back, and I'm sure Martin Luther King Jr. was probably drawing from other philosophers and other individuals and identifying self-love, but he identified, the core part of change is going to be self-love, and self-love is like engaging and understanding one's own experience. And the more that one understands one experience, if you look at that privilege domination kind of combination, that individuals who have privilege in life and they're not engaged in understanding that, they are moving away from a sense of self-understanding, self-care, self-love, that they're benefiting from something that's a disadvantage from somewhere else, and you only could do that if you don't have this sort of component of self-love. I like to think about these ideas like like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like like maybe the self-actualization of trying to get to that space of being more engaged, more aware, more actively involved in trying to understand and shape the system in a way. Yeah, so that's all from Sullivan's work. Then we kind of move into thinking about D'Angelo's work. And if you didn't receive full credit for the papers, probably in this section is where the challenge was talking about racism, rationalism, and matrix of domination. So let's kind of talk about those real briefly. So with racism, the highlight is on the structural level, that historically, and maybe even today, people see racism, some people see racism, identify racism as individual acts versus structural kind of components. I mean, it's both, but it has to be that structural anchor, structural support, structural reinforcement. The roots are based in sort of structural conditions. One person mentioned Kennedy's book, Stamped from the Beginning. That is a really, if you're interested in looking at kind of racial politics, ideas of race over time, Kennedy's book, Stamped from the Beginning, is a really informative, powerful book. I really encourage, and very readable. So I encourage you to jump into that. So yeah, so it's things that are supported, that racism is by institutional level, not the individual level alone. Rationalism, if you hit upon seeing things from different perspectives, understanding the lived experiences of others. Like, we're not looking at the empirical, like, okay, well, how many people, like this whole measuring kind of thing, but rather think about it systematically. If you have a system of privilege and domination, how does that happen? How do we think through the process of even developing that, maintaining it? What are the interests involved in that? Like, these are all just sort of critically thinking about it versus having, those empirical kind of identification of things. Somebody mentioned that racial identity is formed by social practices, and that fits in that rationalism, is understanding those social practices, like just even thinking through how we form racial identity. And then what's racial matrix of domination is making the connection between either how the work of D'Angelo relates to understanding privilege and domination as a system, or the different areas, disciplinary power, institutional or structural, interpersonal, and then that disciplinary kind of component. And then last comment to make is, with white supremacy, one person brought in a quote from C. Wright Mills, which I thought was really powerful. This unnamed, identifying white supremacy as this unnamed political system that basically has shaped and continues to shape our nation. So it's embedded, like this ideal, that white supremacy ideas of that are supporting inequality are embedded within our system itself. And it's trying to understand them in order to, I think it's the goal is to understand in order to start to bring about meaningful change. And, sort of maybe kind of, to identify that part of our democratic ideals, things like equality of opportunity for everyone, the care for community, care for others. I mean, these principles and these ideas and these values that we talk about, these sort of idealized culture, and identifying and looking for and addressing racial inequality or other inequalities is a way to help ensure that to move us towards a greater, more democratic, more system. So it's not radical trying to achieve power over somebody else. It's about trying to achieve a system where we can live out what the creed that we sort of we espouse or aspire to. All right, if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for the wonderful, fabulous write-ups. Yeah, have a great day and see you in class.